The rain had been falling steadily for hours, transforming the city's neon lights into blurry smears of color on the wet pavement. I stood under the awning of a closed bookstore, trying to stay dry while I flagged down a taxi. My phone's battery was dead, and the last bus had left hours ago. Just as I was beginning to think I'd be stuck there all night, a taxi rounded the corner and pulled up to the curb in front of me. The car looked like it had seen better days. Its yellow paint was chipped and dull, and one of the headlights flickered intermittently. I hesitated for a moment, but the thought of spending any more time in the rain pushed me to open the door and slide into the back seat. The leather was cracked and worn, but at least it was dry. "Thanks for stopping," I said, wiping the rain from my face. The driver didn't respond, just started driving as soon as I closed the door. 14th and Elm, please," I added, giving him my address. The driver nodded, his face hidden in the shadows of the front seat. The partition between us was opaque, offering me only a glimpse of the back of his head. His silence was unsettling, but I chalked it up to the late hour. Maybe he was just as tired as I was. As we drove through the deserted streets, I noticed something odd. The city seemed different. Buildings I didn't recognize loomed in the darkness, and the usual hum of traffic was absent. I leaned forward, trying to get a better look at the driver. "Excuse me," I said, raising my voice. "Are we going the right way?" The driver turned slightly, just enough for me to catch a glimpse of his profile. My heart skipped a beat. Where his face should have been, there was only a smooth, featureless expanse of skin. I recoiled in horror, pressing myself against the back seat. "What the hell?" I muttered, my mind racing. "Who are you?" The driver didn't respond. Instead, he turned back to the road, his grip on the steering wheel tightening. Panic surged through me. I fumbled for the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. The lock was jammed, trapping me inside. "Let me out!" I shouted, pounding on the partition. "Let me out of this car!" The driver remained silent, his faceless head unwavering. The car seemed to speed up, the cityscape outside warping and shifting in impossible ways. Streets twisted and turned in ways that defied logic, leading us deeper into an unknown part of the city that felt like it belonged to another world entirely. My breath came in ragged gasps as I realized the truth. This was no ordinary taxi ride. I was being taken somewhere I was never meant to go. Desperation clawed at me, and I began searching the back seat for anything I could use to escape. My fingers brushed against something cold and metallic, a crowbar tucked beneath the seat. I grabbed it, my hands shaking. With a surge of adrenaline, I swung the crowbar at the partition. The first strike barely made a dent, but I kept swinging, fueled by fear and desperation. Cracks began to spiderweb across the opaque barrier. The driver glanced back, and I saw a flicker of something like concern in his faceless visage. "Stop," he commanded, his voice a low, eerie rumble that sent shivers down my spine. But I didn't stop. I swung the crowbar again and again until the partition shattered, revealing the driver in full. His entire face was smooth and featureless, like a mannequin's. His eyes, if he had any, were invisible beneath the unbroken skin. "You can't escape," he said, his voice hollow and echoing. "Your soul is mine." Ignoring his words, I climbed through the broken partition and into the front seat. The car swerved dangerously, but I managed to wrestle the steering wheel from his grasp. We struggled, the car careening wildly through the nightmarish streets. In the chaos, I noticed a glimmer of light in the distance, a beacon of hope. With one final effort, I yanked the wheel hard to the left. The car skidded and crashed into a lamppost, throwing me forward. Pain exploded in my head as I slammed against the dashboard. But I forced myself to stay conscious. I had to escape. The driver was momentarily stunned, giving me a chance to scramble out of the wreckage. I staggered to my feet and ran toward the light, my vision blurred and my body aching. Behind me, I heard the driver emerging from the wrecked taxi, his footsteps slow and deliberate. "You can't outrun fate," he called after me, his voice carrying an unnatural resonance. I didn't look back. I ran with everything I had, the light growing brighter with each step. The world around me seemed to waver and distort, but I kept my focus on that single point of illumination. It was my only chance. Finally, I burst through an invisible barrier and stumbled into a familiar street. The rain was still falling, but the city was back to normal. I collapsed to my knees, gasping for breath, and looked around. The taxi was gone, and the faceless driver was nowhere to be seen. I was safe, or so I thought. As I rose to my feet and started walking, a sense of unease settled over me. The city seemed different again, subtly altered in ways I couldn't quite pinpoint. People passed by, their faces obscured by shadows, their eyes reflecting a cold, unnatural light. My phone buzzed in my pocket, its battery inexplicably restored. I pulled it out and stared at the screen. A single message flashed across it. "You can't escape the afterlife." My heart pounded as I realized the horrible truth. I had never truly escaped. I was still in the faceless driver's world, a realm where the lines between life and death were blurred, and my soul was trapped in a nightmarish limbo. The light I had run toward was a cruel illusion, a beacon leading me deeper into the driver's domain. I was just another passenger in his taxi to the afterlife, forever doomed to wander the twisted, rain-soaked streets of a city that no longer belonged to the living. As the rain continued to fall, I walked on, knowing there was no escape from the faceless driver's grasp. My journey had only just begun, and the true horror of my fate was yet to unfold. The rain was pounding on the roof of the taxi, creating a rhythmic drumming that echoed in the confined space. I was tired from a long day at work and grateful to be heading home. The city lights blurred by, streaks of color against the dark, wet night. I glanced at the driver, an unremarkable man in his late 40s with graying hair and a slightly hunched posture. His name tag read, Sam. "Busy night?" I asked, trying to make small talk to distract myself from the long ride. He glanced at me in the rearview mirror, his eyes cold and calculating. "You could say that," he replied, his voice low and gravelly. I nodded, sensing he wasn't much of a talker. I leaned back and closed my eyes, letting the hum of the engine and the patter of rain lull me into a semi-drowsy state. "Ever hear about the murders in the West End?" Sam's voice cut through the quiet, jolting me awake. "Murders?" I echoed, suddenly alert. "Yeah, I think so. They've been all over the news." He nodded, a strange smile playing on his lips. "Yeah, it's a real mess. They say the killer is smart, real careful. No fingerprints, no evidence, just bodies, left in gruesome displays." A chill ran down my spine. This wasn't the kind of conversation I wanted to have late at night with a stranger. "It's awful," I said, hoping to steer the topic to something less macabre. Sam ignored my discomfort. "I've been driving this taxi for years," he continued. "You wouldn't believe the things I've seen, the people I've met." I shifted uneasily in my seat, glancing at the passing buildings. We were heading out of the city center, the streets growing darker and more deserted. "People confess things to taxi drivers," Sam said, his eyes flicking to the mirror again. They think we're invisible, just part of the scenery. They don't realize we remember. We see everything. I forced a smile, trying to hide my growing unease. I guess that makes sense. People let their guard down. He chuckled, a low, unsettling sound. Exactly. And sometimes they confess things they shouldn't. There was a long silence. The rain seemed to grow louder, the night pressing in around us. I could feel my heart beating faster, a sense of dread creeping over me. Like this one guy, Sam said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. He gets in my cab, middle of the night, just like you. Starts talking about his wife, how she's been cheating on him. He's angry, bitter. Says he's going to make her pay. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. What happened? Sam's smile widened. Next morning they find her body. No evidence, no clues, just a clean, perfect murder. My hands gripped the edge of the seat. Did he confess to you? Sam shook his head slowly. No, but he didn't have to. I could see it in his eyes. The way he talked about her, the satisfaction in his voice. A shiver ran through me. That's terrifying. Sam's gaze fixed on me in the mirror, his eyes dark and unreadable. People are capable of terrible things when they're pushed. You never know who you can trust. I nodded, my heart racing. I wanted to get out of the taxi, but we were in the middle of nowhere. The streets empty and dark. You ever wonder about the killer? Sam asked, his voice softer now. What kind of person they are? What drives them? I guess, I said, my voice shaky. But I try not to think about it too much. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes boring into mine through the mirror. Maybe you should. Maybe you should wonder what kind of person could do such things. What kind of person could hide in plain sight, fool everyone. My blood turned to ice. What are you saying? He smiled again, a slow, chilling smile. I'm saying, maybe you're sitting right next to him. The world seemed to tilt, my vision blurring. What? Maybe I've been confessing to you this whole time, Sam said, his voice almost gentle. Maybe I've been telling you about my nights, my hobbies. My heart pounded in my chest, panic rising. You're joking, right? This is some kind of sick joke. His smile faded, his eyes hardening. Do I look like I'm joking? I glanced around, desperate for a way out. The doors were locked, the windows up. We were speeding down a deserted road, no sign of life anywhere. Please, I whispered, my voice trembling. Let me out. Sam sighed, a sound filled with mock regret. I'm afraid I can't do that. You see, you've heard too much. And like I said, people confess things to taxi drivers, things they shouldn't. I lunged for the door handle, pulling desperately, but it wouldn't budge. Sam laughed, a harsh, cruel sound. There's no escape, he said. You were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Tears streamed down my face as I pounded on the window, screaming for help. But there was no one to hear me, no one to save me. Sam's laughter echoed in the small space, drowning out my cries. Don't worry, he said. It'll be over soon. The taxi sped through the night, carrying me toward an unknown fate. And as the darkness closed in, I realized with a sickening certainty that I was next on Sam's list. Another victim, another confession, lost in the night. It was a dark and rainy night, the kind of night where shadows seemed to swallow the light. I was driving home from a late meeting, the clock nearing midnight. The streets were nearly empty, and the only sound was the rhythmic thump of my windshield wipers. I was tired, my eyes heavy, and my mind fogged with exhaustion. Suddenly, out of nowhere, a figure appeared in front of my car. I slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. There was a sickening thud as the car hit the man, his body rolling over the hood and then disappearing from view. My heart raced and panic seized me. I sat frozen, gripping the steering wheel, my mind racing. I should have gotten out. I should have called for help. But instead, I did the unthinkable. I hit the gas and drove away, my breath coming in shallow, rapid gasps. In my rearview mirror, I saw the crumpled form lying in the street, the rain washing over it. I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. When I got home, I locked myself in the bathroom, splashing water on my face and staring at my reflection in the mirror. My eyes were wide with fear, and my hands trembled. I tried to convince myself that it had been an accident, that I wasn't a monster. But deep down, I knew the truth. I had left that man to die. Days passed, and the guilt gnawed at me like a relentless parasite. I avoided the news, terrified of hearing about the hit and run. I couldn't sleep. The image of the man haunting my dreams. I saw his face everywhere, in every stranger on the street, in every shadow that flitted past my window. One evening, a week after the accident, I received an unusual message on my phone. It was from an unknown number, a single text. "Your ride is here." Confused and uneasy, I looked out the window and saw a taxi idling at the curb. I hadn't called for a taxi, and the sight of it sent a chill down my spine. I ignored the message, but the taxi remained. It was there the next day and the day after that. Always the same text, always the same car. I began to feel as if I was being watched, a constant presence lurking just out of sight. One night, unable to stand it any longer, I decided to confront the driver. I marched out to the taxi, the rain pouring down in sheets. As I approached, the rear window rolled down, and I saw him. The man I had hit. His face was pale, his eyes sunken and hollow, and he stared at me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. "Get in," he said, his voice a raspy whisper that sent shivers down my spine. I wanted to run, but my feet felt rooted to the spot. With a trembling hand, I opened the door and slid into the back seat. The interior was cold, and the smell of damp earth filled my nostrils. The man turned to face me, his eyes boring into mine. "You left me to die," he said, his voice echoing in the confined space. "Now you'll pay the price." The car started moving, and I felt a sense of dread unlike anything I had ever known. The cityscape blurred outside the window, the buildings and lights warping into grotesque shapes. I tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. The windows were sealed shut. "Where are you taking me?" I asked, my voice shaking. "To the place where you left me," he replied, a cruel smile playing on his lips. As we drove, the world outside grew darker, the streetlights flickering and dying one by one. The buildings became twisted and distorted, and the rain turned to a thick, black sludge. I realized with mounting horror that we were no longer in the city. We were somewhere else entirely. A place where the boundaries between life and death were blurred. The taxi came to a stop in front of a crumbling, decrepit house. The windows were shattered, and the door hung off its hinges. The man gestured for me to get out, and I complied, my legs shaking. As I stepped onto the porch, the wood creaked under my weight. "Go inside," he commanded. I pushed open the door and stepped into the darkness. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own. I stumbled through the house, my heart pounding in my chest. Every step I took echoed through the empty rooms, and I felt as if I were being watched by unseen eyes. In the center of the house, I found a room filled with mirrors. They lined the walls, their surfaces cracked and dirty. As I stepped into the room, the door slammed shut behind me, trapping me inside. I looked around, my reflection staring back at me from every angle. Suddenly, the mirrors began to change. Instead of my reflection, I saw scenes from the night of the accident. I watched myself hitting the man, leaving him to die and driving away. The images played on an endless loop, a constant reminder of my guilt. "Do you see?" The man's voice echoed through the room. "This is your punishment. You will relive that night for eternity, trapped in this house of mirrors." I screamed, pounding on the walls, but there was no escape. The mirrors showed no mercy, reflecting my sins back at me in excruciating detail. I fell to my knees, sobbing, as the weight of my actions crushed me. And then, the man appeared in the mirrors, his eyes burning with a vengeful fire. "You took my life," he said, his voice a harsh whisper. "Now I take yours." With a final, shuddering breath, I felt my soul being pulled from my body, drawn into the mirrors. The world went dark, and I knew that I was trapped, a prisoner of my own guilt, forever haunted by the ghost of the man I had killed. The taxi was found abandoned the next morning, the driver's seat empty. The house at the end of the road stood silent and empty, a place forgotten by time. But if you listen closely, on a dark and stormy night, you can still hear the screams of the woman who was cursed by the dead driver, forever reliving her darkest nightmare.